In August 1986, the Albuquerque Journal published a startling story. According to documents that had just been declassified because of a Freedom of Information Act request, the Air Force in 1957 had dropped a giant thermonuclear bomb just outside of Albuquerque. The details of this accident and why it took 29 years to find out about it is a cautionary tale of the Cold War and history that deserves to be remembered. On May 22, 1957, at around 11:15 a.m., a Convair B-36 Peacemaker bomber, piloted by Air Force Captain Dick Meyer, was preparing to land at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. The plane had come from Biggs Air Force Base, now called Biggs Army Airfield, in El Paso, Texas, where Meyer's squadron, the 334th Bombardment Squadron of the 95th Bombardment Wing, was stationed. Because various airmen either needed flight time or transport, the plane had 2 crews aboard, including 3 pilots. But the plane was relatively lightweight. Built as an intercontinental strategic bomber, the B-36 could carry an enormous 320,000 pounds of fuel, but this B-36 was carrying less than a third of that, owing to the short distance of the flight from El Paso to Albuquerque. Meyer was on the landing approach, some 1,700 feet up and about 4 miles from Kirtland, when the plane suddenly jumped up almost 1,000 feet. At the same time, the scanner, a crew member who was stationed about halfway between the wings and the tail of the plane, yelled, "Bombs away!" In a 1986 newspaper interview, Meyer said, "Someone yelled, 'Shit!' He added, 'It might have been me.'" Bombs away certainly would explain why the plane suddenly jumped 1,000 feet. The B-36 Meyer was piloting was only carrying 1 bomb that day, but the bomb, 24.5 feet long and 5 feet in diameter, weighed more than 42,000 pounds. The bomb was so heavy that when it fell, the bomb doors were closed, but the bomb simply tore right through the bottom of the plane. It was the loss of the weight of the massive bomb, especially with the plane so lightly loaded, that caused it to lurch into the air. But the reason for shouting an expletive wasn't just the effort of trying to control a plane that suddenly gained 1,000 feet of altitude 4 miles from the runway. The bomb that had just fallen in New Mexico was not an ordinary bomb. The Mark 17 was a hydrogen bomb, with an expected nuclear yield of 15 megatons, or the equivalent of 15 million metric tons of TNT. The bomb that had fallen through the bottom of Meyer's B-36 was the most destructive weapon the United States has ever built. Its potential yield was roughly 625 times the power of the atomic bomb dropped in Hiroshima in 1945. Developed at Los Alamos National Laboratory, the Mark 17 was the result of a project to build an aircraft-deliverable thermonuclear weapon, part of the strategy of massive retaliation, prevention of war via mutually assured destruction. The bomb design had been tested with the Runt device used in the Castle Romeo test at Bikini Atoll in 1954, the photo of which has become an iconic image of the nuclear mushroom cloud. 200 Mark 17 bombs have been built, with an additional 105 of the similar Mark 24. As some of the most complex and highly classified weapons in the U.S. arsenal, maintenance on the bombs was done at Los Alamos. Kirtland Air Force Base, which had originated as a civilian airfield and had been established as Albuquerque Army Air Base in 1941, had been used for advanced pilot and bombardier training during the Second World War. But because of its proximity to the Los Alamos Laboratory, the base had become a staging area for the Manhattan Project. After the war, Kirtland had been made an Air Force base, rather than be decommissioned like many Second World War bases, largely to service the needs of Los Alamos and the nearby Sandia National Laboratories, created in 1949 for the purpose of weapons development. The bomb that had accidentally fallen on New Mexico was being transported to Los Alamos for routine maintenance. The reason the bomb was being carried on a B-36 bomber was simple. The B-36 was the only aircraft in the Air Force arsenal at the time capable of carrying the huge Mark 17 bomb. Introduced in 1948, the Convair B-36 Peacemaker was massive. It was the largest mass-produced piston-engine aircraft ever built, and at 230 feet had the longest wingspan of any combat aircraft ever built. In fact, the B-36 wingspan was nearly twice as wide as the distance originally flown by the Wright Flyer in 1903 in what is usually considered the first controlled mechanically powered airplane flight. Designed to be able to deliver any nuclear weapon in the United States arsenal, the B-36 had a range of 10,000 miles, allowing it to be capable of intercontinental flight without refueling, and had an enormous payload capacity of 87,200 pounds, more than 10 times what a World War II B-17 bomber could carry. The B-36 was originally outfitted with 6 28-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp major radial engines. The engines were mounted in an unusual pusher configuration with the propellers on the back. By the time of the accident, Convair had added a pair of General Electric J47-19 jet engines, suspended near the end of each wing, giving the bomber 10 engines, more than any other mass-produced aircraft in history. This configuration resulted in the slogan, 6 turnin' and 4 burnin'. Not only was the B-36 the only bomber capable of carrying a Mark 17, but Kirtland was one of only a handful of Air Force bases with runway facilities that could receive a B-36. First Lieutenant Jack Williams, the flight engineer, said he heard a dull thud as the bomb hit the ground. While the Mark 17 was designed to deploy with 3 parachutes to stabilize the bomb's descent, the bomb had come out at too low an altitude for the chutes to fully deploy. Meyer swung the plane around. He knew that there was no risk of a 15-megaton explosion. As an implosion nuclear weapon, the Mark 17 required plutonium pits, that is, fissile material necessary to start a chain reaction that produces a nuclear yield. The pits were on board the aircraft, but to prevent an accident, they were stored away from the bomb, only to be inserted in the case of nuclear war. Still, the bomb had a significant amount of conventional explosive required for the process of implosion and included radioactive material. Stan Norris, an expert on nuclear weapons with the Natural Resources Defense Council, noted in the LA Times in 1986 that the Mark 17 was very primitive by today's standards in terms of safety devices. As the plane turned, Meyer said in a 1986 interview, "We saw the plume of it, more dust cloud than anything. And a light plane was in the area, and it'd like to have blown him out of the sky from the explosion." At the same time, both Meyer and Williams said that First Lieutenant Bob Karp, a junior navigator, came charging out of the bomb bay saying, "I didn't touch anything! I didn't touch anything!" A line that they were able to laugh at as soon as they realized they had not caused a thermonuclear explosion over Albuquerque. Electronics operator Jack Resin described Karp's face as he came out of the bomb bay as "wider than any sheet you ever saw." Karp had been carrying out a normal procedure in the bomb bay. The Mark 17 hung on a wraparound sling, which had a locking pin about an inch in diameter designed to prevent the bomb from dropping by accident. But the pin was left out when taking off or landing, in case the plane ran into trouble and had to release the bomb due to a problem with the aircraft. So after takeoff, a crewman had to crawl into the bomb bay and manually insert the pin. And as the plane moved into the traffic pattern for landing, a crewman would have to crawl back in and pull the pin out. But as the B-36 approached Kirtland and Karp pulled out the pin, something went wrong. The bomb manual release mechanism was in the wrong position, and when Karp pulled out the pin, the bomb released. Karp said in 1986, "Imagine standing on a catwalk over the bomb and removing the pin, and the bomb went crashing down." According to the documents released to the Albuquerque Journal, a protective cover enclosed the wire near the release mechanism. But the sling had been repositioned and the cover was moved, causing a length of the manual release wire to be exposed. Exactly how that occurred was a mystery, as the documents provided by the Air Force had blacked out the paragraph that might explain how the wire became exposed. While some have speculated that Karp accidentally grabbed the release as the plane hit a bit of turbulence, he himself said that the handle had snagged on his safety cable, and that the vibrations of the plane's frame had likely disconnected the wire. He said, "I'd been puzzled how something like this could happen with as many safeguards as we have had in the system," but he also added, the technology was basically 10 years behind. The bomb was so large that it broke right through the closed and latched bomb bay doors. The radio operator, George Houston, immediately contacted Kirtland and told the stunned operator, "We've dropped a hydrogen bomb!" The Air Force was understandably concerned. As Meyer tells it, "We were met with quite a group of VIPs when we landed." The bomb landed just short of the Air Force Base on uninhabited land owned by the University of New Mexico. The conventional explosives on the bomb had exploded on impact, making a significant crater, 12 feet deep and 25 feet in diameter, and disintegrating the bomb. Sadly, there was one casualty on the ground. A cow grazing nearby had been caught in the explosion. While there was some radioactive contamination found, it did not go beyond about a mile from the crater. According to Air Force documents, Field Command, a division of the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, conducted recovery and cleanup operations at the site. Meyer indicated that he heard that the Air Force paid a farmer for the loss of the cow and paid a fee to the university for tearing up the surrounding land in order to haul away the radioactive dirt. The crew spent the next day giving affidavits, and eventually the Air Force decided not to assign any blame to the officers involved. The investigation actually went rather quickly, as all the experts that would usually have to be called in were at Kirkland or Sandia. Perhaps the most interesting part of this early broken arrow, meaning an event involving a nuclear weapon which results in the accidental launching, firing, detonation, theft, or loss of the weapon, is how it was kept so completely secret at the time. As Robert Karp explained, it was a different time in world history. We had a Cold War going on. The first time the Air Force even acknowledged that the event occurred was in 1981, when they released a brief statement that only said that a nuclear weapon of some type had been dropped. The details didn't come out until 1986, when the Albuquerque Journal obtained records through a Freedom of Information Act request. And then, after the story was reported and no longer secret, crew members began to come forward and tell the story. Interestingly, the two pieces of Cold War technology involved, the Mark 17 nuclear weapon and the B-36 strategic bomber, were both nearly obsolete at the time. The Mark 17 was removed from service before the end of 1957. Better Soviet interceptors had made piston-driven bombers vulnerable, and the B-36, which was both too slow and also not designed for in-air refueling capability, was already in the process of being replaced in 1957. The last Convair B-36 Peacemaker was taken out of service in February 1959. While some were used for reconnaissance, the B-36 never dropped a bomb in combat. Today, the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History, an affiliate of the Smithsonian Institution, which was originally housed in Kirkland Air Force Base and is now housed in the city of Albuquerque, just a few miles from where this bomb dropped, has the mission of serving as the nation's resource on nuclear history and science. Among its permanent displays is the casing for a Mark 17 hydrogen bomb. On the lazy morning of March 11, 1958, Walter Gregg and his family worked and played near the home that he had built on land that his family had owned for nearly 100 years. When an Air Force plane flew over, he didn't think much of it. Air Force planes flew over his property quite frequently. Little could the Greggs know that they were about to become part of Cold War history. In 2003, Walter Gregg, then 82, said, "Not too many people can say they've had a nuclear bomb dropped on them. Not too many would want to." The 1958 Mars Bluff nuclear weapon incident deserves to be remembered. At 8 a.m. on March 11, 1958, a specialized crew began loading a B-47E aircraft, number 531876 Alpha, of the 375th Bombardment Squadron of the 305th Bombardment Wing. Writing in 2013 edition of Air Force magazine, aviation historian and former B-47 pilot Walter J. Boyne described the B-47 as the perfect strategic weapon for its time. The Boeing B-47 Stratojet, an official nickname never used by its crews, had entered service in 1951. The radical new design used swept wings, an innovation largely possible because of data captured from Germans during the Second World War, and jet engines placed on nacelles underneath the wing, innovations that would affect both military and passenger aircraft production in the post-war era. The bomber had exceptional performance characteristics, with a top speed in excess of 600 miles per hour and a range in excess of 2,000 miles. The B-47 became a mainstay of the U.S. Air Force's Strategic Air Command's bomber strength. Eventually 2,032 were built, and manufacturers Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas were all contracted to build B-47s to meet the delivery schedule. Along with the B-47, the Air Force built a large fleet of in-air refueling tankers, at first Boeing KB-50s and KC-97s, and starting in 1957, the more capable KC-135. Boeing explained, "The tankers gave legs to the B-47 fleet and established it as a global threat." But those legs required hours of flight time, which placed quite a stress on the plane's three-person crew. As Boeing noted, the three-man crew flew a vastly more complicated aircraft than had the 10-man crews of the B-29 or B-50. And thus the plane that was being loaded the morning of March 11th was part of a program to prepare crews for the long-distance missions that would be required in the case of war with the Soviet Union. The plane was participating in Operation Snow Flurry. Clark Rumrill, an Air Force officer who was stationed at Hunter Air Force Base at the time, wrote in a September 2000 edition of American Heritage magazine, "Snow Flurry was not routine training, but rather part of a unit-simulated combat mission and special weapons exercise. Aircraft 53-1876 Alpha, accompanied by 3 other B-47s from the 375th Bombardment Squadron, was to fly to England, conducting a mid-air refueling en route off the east coast of Canada, and make a practice bomb run over England, transmitting an electronic signal to simulate the bomb release. Computers on the ground were to determine the accuracy of the drop and award points accordingly. The crew would then fly to a Strategic Air Command base in North Africa and back to Georgia. Had the mission been completed, Rumrell explained, the crew would have had a tense, exhausting 18-hour day. Such missions were of particular importance. As Boyne explains, the bomber debuted at a time when Strategic Air Command was undergoing an explosive expansion in size that diluted standardization efforts and the effectiveness of training and safety procedures. In a period of expansion, training crews on the operation of the complex aircraft was more difficult, and crews needed experience. But there was another component of this special weapon exercise. The B-47 was to carry a nuclear bomb to Bruntingthorpe Air Base in England. That chilly morning in March, the crew was loading a Mark VI nuclear bomb. The Mark VI was a fission, that is nuclear, not thermonuclear bomb, developed from the Mark III Fat Man bomb that had been dropped on Nagasaki in August 1945. The bomb weighed 7,600 pounds, was 10 feet 8 inches long, and had a maximum diameter of 61 inches. Its nuclear yield was around 30 kilotons. However, the bomb was not carried assembled. That is, to prevent detonation, the nuclear core was carried separately from the weapon. In the event of war, the bomb would be assembled in flight. That morning, the load proved to be troublesome, as the loading team had trouble engaging the steel locking pin. The B-47 was difficult to fly. Boyne explained that the plane was a hybrid of World War II metallurgy, construction techniques, and aerodynamic theory that was sometimes inadequate for the new era of jet engines. The plane could be especially difficult to handle when fully loaded. Nuclear bombs of the era were heavy, and as a safety measure, the bomb was designed with an emergency release, a pneumatically powered catch, allowing the crew to jettison the bomb almost immediately in the event they were encountering difficulties in takeoff or landing. During regular flight, a manually inserted locking pin locked the bomb in place so that it could not be dropped accidentally, but the pin was disengaged during takeoff and landing. The crew called for help from the Weapons Release Systems Supervisor, who managed to get the locking pin to engage by jiggling the pin with a hammer until it was seated. However, Rumrell notes the crew failed to run the locking pin through its engage-disengage cycle, possibly because of pressure to complete the loading process in a specified amount of time. The plane was loaded, and the crew went through its pre-flight checks and pre-flight briefing. The pilot, Captain Earl Keeler, started the engines at 3:42 p.m., and following procedure, the co-pilot, Captain Charles Woodruff, disengaged the locking pin, which was operated by a lever, for takeoff. As the plane gained altitude, Woodruff used the lever to re-engage the pin, but it wouldn't re-engage. This was a problem, as the pin would have to be manually seated. The job fell to the navigator bombardier, Captain Bruce Kulka, but it was not as simple as it sounds. The B-47 was pressurized, and sending Kulka to the bomb bay required depressurizing the plane, which at 15,000 feet required that the crew go on oxygen. Perhaps worse, as Rumrell explained, the entrance to the bomb bay was so narrow that a parachute could not be worn into it. Kulka would be required to climb around the bomb bay of a jostling aircraft, searching for a mechanism he'd never been trained to find, with no parachute should something go wrong in the bay. The pin mechanism, it turns out, was high up above the bomb. Kulka, in trying to climb to reach the pin, accidentally grabbed the emergency bomb release mechanism as a handhold. The 7,000-pound bomb released, landing momentarily on the bomb bay doors. Kulka had mere moments to find something to hold on to. As the huge bomb broke open the bomb bay doors, Rumrell said, he managed to grab something, he wasn't sure what, and haul himself to safety. Walter Gregg had been a paratrooper during the war. On March 11th, according to the Charlotte Observer, the 32-year-old was fixing a bench in a makeshift workshop in the garage, about 50 feet to the rear of his frame house in the Mars Bluff community, some 10 miles east of Florence, South Carolina. His son, 6-year-old Walter Jr., was in the garage with him. His wife, Ethel May Helms Gregg, called Effie, was inside the house sewing. Their daughters, 9-year-old twins Helen and Frances, played in the yard nearby with their cousin, Ella Davies. The newspaper continued. Overhead, the lazy drone of an airplane engine could be heard. It grew louder. Gregg observed as he worked. Must be flying pretty low, he mused. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rent the air. While the bomb did not have its nuclear core, it did include the high explosive trigger, the part of the bomb that compresses the nuclear core to a critical mass. The bomb that had just fallen 15,000 feet contained around 2,000 pounds of high explosive. Rummel explained, there are two types of high explosives that could be used in the trigger. One could be set off by concussion, such as a bullet or contact with the ground. The other, the type the military invariably insists upon, could take great physical abuse without going off. Unfortunately, the triggers used in nuclear weapons in 1958 contain the former. According to the Florence Morning News, Walter Jr. said, "Daddy, Daddy, what happened?" His father replied, "I don't know, sonny. I think an airplane exploded." Greg told the Associated Press, "It must have been a moment before the air cleared from the dust and I could see. I looked around and my living house was gone. It was falling all to pieces. The garage started to fall apart too. I got out of there." Effie told the paper, "I remember sewing, and the next thing I can recall, I was crawling out from under boards and plaster." In March 2018, Ella, 9 at the time of the explosion, told the Associated Press that she remembered stacking bricks to make a kitchen to play house, and the next thing she knew, she was running down the driveway with blood streaming from a gash above her eye. She doesn't remember the actual blast. Her cousin, Helen, remembered getting up from the ground to find an entire stand of pines where the 6-year-old had just climbed down from her tree fort, flattened. The Griggs put the kids in a car and raced to a hospital. Ella told the Associated Press that she remembers the speedometer reading 80 miles per hour and her yelling at the driver to slow down. The Griggs' home was only some 300 yards away from U.S. Highway 301, which the Charlotte Observer described as a major New York to Miami route. A traveling salesman on the road named J.A. Sanders said the concussion was so great it turned his car around on the road. Highway patrolman D.D. Mobley had just stopped on the side of the road. He told the Morning News, "It was like a whoosh, a tremendous blast that shook my car. It shook me for an instant. I didn't know what happened." A nearby resident, W.G. Wallace, reported that he heard the bomb whistle as it fell. The blast leveled the chimney on his house and broke windows. Greg explained to the paper that the bomb, or whatever it was, landed about 100 yards from the house, right in the garden. It left a hole about 40 feet in diameter, and I don't know how deep. The Morning News reported that portions of the weapon were found 700 yards from the crater. In the air, Keeler's first priority was to report the incident to his superiors. Rumroll explained, "In case of an unscheduled bomb drop, Air Force regulations require the crew to immediately notify its base by a special coded message." But there was a problem, he continued. Because the procedure had never been used, the Operations Center at Hunter Air Force Base didn't recognize the strange incoming message. Keeler eventually had to radio the local Florence airport and ask them to telephone the Air Force Base that the plane had lost a device. The conversation was overheard by a private pilot and reported in newspapers. The crew then flew over to photograph the site with their aerial camera and then had to circle for nearly 3 hours to burn off fuel before landing. Rummer recalled that upon landing, the crew was treated as if there was a possibility they'd dropped the bomb deliberately. Their sidearms were confiscated and they were locked in a room until they convinced commanders that the loss was an accident. Teams from the Air Force and Civil Air Patrol quickly came and sealed off the area. They reported that they found no radiation. None of the Griggs' injuries were life-threatening, although Effie and Ella had to have stitches. In 2003, Walter Gregg told the Sun News, "It's incredible when you think about it that nobody got killed." In the end, the bomb damaged about a dozen homes and the Mount Mitzvah Baptist Church. The Greggs also lost an unknown number of chickens in the blast, although their kitten, Mitzi, was uninjured. The crater, while on private land, is still visible today. Incredibly, the Mars Bluff incident was the second time that the Air Force had lost a device in a period of just over a month. Just the previous February, another nuclear bomb had been lost near Tybee Island, Georgia, when it was jettisoned by a B-47 after a mid-air collision. Both stories were widely reported at the time and raised concerns in both the United States and Europe over the U.S. nuclear arsenal and U.S. planes, and received condemnation from the Soviet Union. It did spur the United States to make certain changes in the safety mechanisms for the nuclear arsenal, including formulating different high explosives for the nuclear triggers that were less likely to explode by accident. Eventually, the Air Force reimbursed the Greggs for the damages, but it wasn't enough to rebuild, something that his daughter said Walter Gregg resented all his life. Still, Gregg became friends with the crew of the aircraft, who reached out to him to apologize for bombing his home. They corresponded throughout his life. Walter Gregg passed away in 2013 at the age of 92. There was a period during the Cold War when tensions were so high that the United States kept nuclear-armed heavy bombers in the air 24/7. Every hour of the day there were bombers that were airborne, ready to drop their bombs under the belief that those bombers would guarantee a second strike capability even if a first strike by the Soviet Union had destroyed all of America's airfields. It was an amazing program carried on by our nation's armed forces, an astounding feat of logistics, but it did raise a problem because all of that flight time meant that accidents would occur, and if an accident occurred, then that would necessarily involve thermonuclear bombs. And it's perhaps a statement on how inured we become to the existence of nuclear weapons that the nation seems to have forgotten about the five airplane crashes involving thermonuclear bombs that occurred during the lifetime of the program that was called Operation Chrome Dome. It is history that deserves to be remembered. At the height of the Cold War, leaders sincerely feared their opponent would contemplate nuclear Armageddon and believed that nuclear war could only be avoided on a credible promise that if either side were to launch a first strike, they would inevitably be destroyed themselves as well. But that status quo was challenged with the advent of nuclear missiles and what the U.S. perceived to be a missile gap. For example, in the period 1961 to 1963, national intelligence estimates were that the Soviet Union had between 200 and 300 intercontinental ballistic missiles and 700 to 800 intermediate-range missiles. That was enough that, intelligence estimated, the Soviet Union could destroy all the U.S. and Allied nuclear retaliatory forces, even if those forces were on ground alert. To fill the gap, the Allies needed to be able to have their strategic bombers respond more quickly than ground alert allowed. General Thomas S. Power, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Strategic Air Command, pioneered the somewhat radical idea that the Air Force's new bomber, the B-52, could maintain 24-hour airborne alert duty. U.S. bombers carrying hydrogen bombs and all the codes and equipment needed to arm and deploy those bombs would be airborne at all times, loitering at strategic locations outside Soviet airspace where they could quickly retaliate or counter any threat. The idea was radical. It would press the equipment and the personnel in ways that had never been tested before. The idea of aerial refueling goes back to the 1920s. The first known in-flight refueling between two planes occurred on June 27, 1923, between two Airco DH-4B biplanes of the United States Army Air Service. Using this process, DH-4Bs were able to set a number of air endurance records in the early 1920s. And later aircraft continued to experiment with the process and set endurance records through the 1930s. But these systems, despite their obvious potential, were still rudimentary and dangerous, and none were regularly utilized during the Second World War. You could say that the idea had truly achieved its potential when, from February 26th to March 3rd of 1949, an American B-50 Superfortress long-range heavy bomber named Lucky Lady II of the 43rd Bomb Wing flew non-stop around the world in 94 hours and 1 minute, a feat made possible by in-flight refueling. But in reality, the process for keeping heavy bombers in the air for long periods of time was already being tested by the Air Force prior to Lucky Lady II's flight. SAC had been considering some version of Air Alert for years, but the technology was not considered to be ready. The first test of the concept was done in the spring of 1958 under the codename Operation Curtain Raiser, using B-36 bombers of the 72nd Bomb Wing flying from Ramey Air Force Base in Puerto Rico. Then that winter, the test continued with Operation Head Start, using B-52 bombers of the 42nd Heavy Bomb Wing, first from Loring Air Force Base in Maine and then from Bergstrom Air Force Base in Texas. The program required more than improving in-flight fueling techniques. They included researching maintenance schedules, crew schedules, flight paths, and even crew nutrition. To be sure, the program was controversial within the military and the government. General Curtis LeMay, who had previously been the director of the Strategic Air Command and, from 1957, was Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, expressed concerns about cost, flexibility, crew fatigue, the ability to coordinate the plane's attack with other forces, competition with other Air Force priorities, and the impact on longevity of the B-52 bombers. Oddly, he did not list among his concerns the fear that there could be accidents involved with constantly operating heavy bombers carrying thermonuclear weapons. Certainly one of the most pressing issues of the technology was the in-flight refueling, which had not to that point been used on anything approaching this scale. The Lucky Lady II was refueled using the clumsy looped hose method in a modified B-29. The system depended upon the tanker using a sort of grappling hook to grab a cable let out by the receiver aircraft. The Air Force knew at the time the system was too clumsy for regular use. Next, the Air Force tested a probe and drogue system, where the tanker uses a flexible hose with a basket that goes over a probe on the receiver aircraft. While this is a far simpler system than the looped hose method and still widely used today and preferred by the U.S. Navy, the system has a limited flow rate due to the flexibility of the hose. Instead, the U.S. Air Force preferred a rigid flying boom, where an extendable boom is maneuvered into a receptacle on the receiving aircraft. But even with this system, the Air Force had a problem with their tanker aircraft. The KB-29 and its replacement, the KC-97 Stratofreighter, were both developments of the Boeing B-29. As piston-driven aircraft, they were too slow for jet aircraft, causing many problems and risks in refueling. A B-52 typically had to raise its flaps and lower its landing gear to slow down enough for aerial refueling. In addition, the piston-driven aircraft required a reduction in altitude to around 16,000 to 18,000 feet, which often put the bombers right in the clouds and turbulence as they were being refueled. In 1957, the Air Force started phasing in the Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker. Based on the Boeing 707, the KC-135 was the Air Force's first jet-powered refueling tanker. Finally, the Air Force had a workable system to practically allow airborne alert duty. Despite continued concerns by the Air Force about costs, SAC continued to fly fully prepared nuclear-armed strategic bombers in the air around the clock for the next decade. The broader program became called Operation Chrome Dome. Operation Chrome Dome might have as many as a dozen bombers in the air and ready to strike at any time of the day or night. A typical Chrome Dome mission, which might be flown by one B-52 or a group of three called a cell, would take off from Fairchild Air Force Base near Spokane, Washington, across the U.S. to the Atlantic Ocean, up to the Arctic Circle, turn towards Alaska, and then back to Fairchild. The mission would take around 24 hours and include 2 in-flight refuelings. Crews quickly became adept at the system. But Chrome Dome meant a huge amount of flight hours. Over 6,000 airborne alert missions had been flown by 1961. With that much flying, things would certainly go wrong. While the program was itself no secret, General Power had announced the operation publicly, as the purpose was deterrence, the Air Force was characteristically obtuse to the public about the risks. A quotation from SAC in Time magazine in 1961 said, "At worst, only the TNT in an unarmed H-bomb explodes on impact." The first accident involving nuclear bombs of Operation Chrome Dome came January 24, 1961, over Goldsboro, North Carolina. A B-52G experienced a fuel leak that evolved into a structural problem, causing the crew to lose control of the aircraft. 5 of the crew bailed out safely, 3 died. One of the 2 nuclear bombs on board was recovered, and another buried itself so deeply in a field that it could not be recovered. The Air Force bought an easement on the land, and much of the bomb is still buried there today. Neither of the bomb's high explosive components had exploded, and no radiation was released. But the bombs had progressed through much of their arming sequences, moving them dangerously close to a nuclear detonation. Experts still disagree as to the extent of that possibility. Flaws were found in the design of the wet wing of the B-52 designed to hold fuel, and the areas susceptible to fatigue were modified to improve stability. 2 months later, in March, a series of mechanical failures and crew mistakes caused a B-52F to run out of fuel near Yuba City, California. The crew all managed to eject from the plane safely, and the plane crashed into a clear, flat barley field. The onboard nuclear weapons were released, but their safety interlocks held, and there was no explosion or release of radiation. A third crash during Operation Chrome Dome occurred in January 1964, when the stabilizer of a B-52B broke off in rough weather. The plane crashed in rough territory near Savage Mountain, Maryland. 1 crew member was unable to eject, and 2 more froze to death after bailing out of the plane. The nuclear bombs, however, were recovered relatively intact. 3 accidents was not a surprise given the large amount of flight time involved in Operation Chrome Dome, but none of those 3 accidents had resulted in any radiation loss or even the explosion of the high explosives on the nuclear warheads. But that luck would run out on January 17, 1966. A B-52G flying from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina was flying the southern route of Operation Chrome Dome, which took it across the Atlantic, over Spain, and into the Mediterranean before returning home by Gibraltar. During the second refueling off the coast of Spain, the B-52 came in too fast. The boom operator did not, reportedly, call for the B-52 to break away. The B-52 struck the boom. The collision severed the left wing of the B-52, causing a fuel explosion that destroyed the KC-135, killing all 4 crew members aboard. 2 members of the B-52 crew were located near the point of the collision and were not able to eject. A third ejected, but his chute did not open. The B-52 radar navigator suffered severe burns, but landed safely and was taken to the hospital. 3 other crew members safely ejected, but they landed in the ocean, where they were rescued by fishermen. On board the disintegrating aircraft were 4 Mark 28 hydrogen bombs. 3 fell to the earth near the Spanish village of Palomares. The 4th fell into the ocean. 1 of the 3 landed via parachute and was intact, but the conventional explosives on the other 2 exploded on impact, causing radioactive contamination across some 2.6 square miles of farmland, woods, and residential areas, dispersing some 7 pounds of plutonium-239, a dangerous and toxic carcinogen. Air Force personnel were rushed from U.S. Air Force bases across Spain to aid in the cleanup. The U.S. and Spain dug up 6,000 barrels of contaminated soil and shipped it back to the United States. The Air Force called for the assistance of the Navy to recover the 4th bomb. Nearly 30 Navy vessels were involved in the search, which took more than 2 months, despite having a witness who saw the bomb hit the water. The bomb was eventually recovered using some of the highest technology recovery vehicles in the Navy: the submarine recovery ship USS Petrel, the deep submergent vehicle Alvin, and the cable-controlled undersea recovery vehicle Curve 1. After the accident, Spain forbade the U.S. Air Force from overflying Spanish territory with aircraft carrying nuclear weapons, and other countries issued complaints as well. Operation Chrome Dome was ended 2 years later in 1968 when a 5th accident occurred, this one also releasing radioactive material, this time in Greenland. Despite the cleanup, more radioactive material was found near Palomares in 2006 and then at another site in 2008, and the United States and Spain have entered into another agreement to do further monitoring and cleanup at the site. Both governments claim that they found no ill health effects for the people of Palomares as a result of the incident, but other experts argue that the site has been poorly monitored and that the health effects are still unknown. The empty casings of 2 of the bombs involved in this incident are now on display in the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Air Force personnel who were involved in the cleanup now claim a number of lingering health effects that they claim came from inadequate safety procedures. The Air Force has denied any such links, and secrecy surrounding the event has made it difficult for the personnel who have been so affected to claim benefits. In the end, it's not a surprise that Operation Chrome Dome resulted in accidents. It was a very ambitious program that kept nuclear-armed bombers in the air around the clock for a decade. It was almost certainly going to lead to some accidents. But in fairness to the program, we cannot know the effect that it had on nuclear deterrence during the tensest periods of the Cold War. Operation Chrome Dome might well have prevented nuclear Armageddon. Still, the 5 accidents of Operation Chrome Dome remind us that no system is perfect, and that is important to know in the nuclear age. It is history that deserves to be remembered. "1980 was an interesting time in American history. Jimmy Carter was president, although it was a presidential election year. Inflation was a national concern, over 13%. Changes in miniaturization technology meant that a number of consumer items were available for the first time. For example, VHS recorders, personal camcorders, and fax machines. Pac-Man was first introduced in arcades in 1980, and Post-it notes went on sale for the first time in 1980. In 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, and in 1980, Iran and Iraq went to war. And on September 19th, 1980, near the tiny town of Damascus, Arkansas, a Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile, topped with the largest thermonuclear warhead in the U.S. strategic nuclear arsenal, exploded. Yeah, you heard me right. The missile exploded, but the warhead did not. And to understand what happened in the 1980 Damascus Titan II explosion, first we have to understand what was in the silo. The Titan rocket family is a family of expendable rockets built by the Glenn L. Martin Company and first introduced with the Titan I in 1959. The Titan I was the first multi-stage intercontinental ballistic missile in the U.S. inventory. In use from 1959 to 1965, the primary limitation of the Titan I is that the fuel could not be stored at room temperature and thus could not be stored in the rocket. To launch, the rocket had to be moved up from the silo and fueled, and that made it slow to launch. The Titan I was replaced by the Titan II, which used storable propellants, allowing it to be stored fueled and making it much faster to launch. It could actually be launched from its silo in less than 60 seconds. It was larger, 50% larger than a Titan I, but carried more than double the payload, a greater distance, with more accuracy. Although designed as an intercontinental ballistic missile, a dozen of the Titan II rockets were used as part of the Gemini manned space program in the 1960s. As an intercontinental ballistic missile, the Titan II carried the W-53 thermonuclear warhead. The W-53 weighed about 8,100 pounds and had a yield of about 9 megatons. Now, to put that in perspective, a 9 megaton explosion would be the equivalent of about 3 times the energy of all the explosives used throughout the entirety of the Second World War, including the nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The fireball alone from a 9 megaton explosion would have been enough to cause fatal burns to any unprotected human within 20 miles of the blast. Although we briefly fielded a larger airdropped thermonuclear bomb, the 25 megaton B-41, the W-53 was, in 1980, the largest thermonuclear device still in the American arsenal, and the largest ever mounted by the United States on a missile. A total of 63 Titan II intercontinental ballistic missiles with W-53 warheads were in service with the U.S. Strategic Air Command between 1963 and 1987, with missiles on continuous alert during that period in silos in Arizona, Kansas, and with the 308th Strategic Missile Wing in Arkansas. The fuel that allows you to store a Titan II missile fully fueled is a mix of hydrazine and dinitrogen tetroxide. It's called a hypergolic propellant. These types of fuels use 2 components, a fuel and an oxidizer, which ignite when they come into contact. Now, the advantage of hypergolic propellants is that they can be stored in liquid form at room temperature, and they can be easily and reliably ignited. And the Titan II is a 2-stage rocket, which means it's got 2 different pieces, each with its own supply of fuel and oxidizer. The downside of hypergolic propellants is that the chemicals used are corrosive and extremely toxic to humans. In fact, a propellant leak in August of 1978 in a silo outside of Rock, Kansas, killed 2 Air Force personnel due to the toxicity of the chemicals. And the dangers of the poisonous and explosive chemicals became quite clear the night of September 18, 1980, in the Titan II Launch Complex 374-7 in northern Arkansas, approximately 50 miles from Little Rock. At 6:30 p.m., an airman who was part of a team doing a routine pressure check on the second stage of the missile accidentally dropped the socket from a 3-foot-long ratchet. The approximately 8-pound socket head dropped some 80 feet, bounced off a thrust mount, and struck the rocket's first stage, piercing its skin and causing it to leak Aerozine-50 fuel. This is not good. Not only is Aerozine-50 highly toxic, creating this brown acetic smoke, but if it comes in contact with its oxidizer, it will explode. And as the fuel was leaking from the lower stage of the rocket, that meant that the weight of the rocket could have caused it to collapse in on itself, causing both stages to explode inside the silo. And that raises an interesting question. Could that have caused the thermonuclear warhead to detonate? A nuclear warhead does include conventional explosives, combined in what is called an explosive lens as part of the process of detonation. And heat may cause those to explode by accident. And while the explosives used on the older W-53 warhead were somewhat more vulnerable to heat than those used today, the missile was what was called one-point safe, meaning that the explosion of only one of the explosive components could not cause detonation. The missile design required extremely precise timing for the explosion of its high explosive components in order to produce a nuclear yield, and that's practically impossible for that to happen by accident. But while a fire could not really cause the missile to explode like a thermonuclear bomb, it could cause the warhead to explode and spread its radioactive material all over northern Arkansas, and in fact, that was a greater risk with the older W-53 warhead because it lacked a modern safety component called a fire-resistant pit that all missiles today would have, and that is specifically designed to reduce plutonium dispersal in the case of a fire. A second risk comes from the electronic components that are designed to detonate the missile. Modern safety measures include something called Enhanced Nuclear Detonation Safety, or ENDS. This involves the enclosure of detonation-critical components in a barrier to prevent unintended energy sources from powering or operating the weapon's functions. Since 1993, Congress has required that every American missile design include not one, but two barriers in order to prevent accidental detonation. But the W-53 predated that rule and did not include an ENDS barrier. In 1993, Department of Energy Deputy Assistant Secretary for Military Application Winfred Ellis noted of the stockpiled B-53 warheads, which operate the same way as the W-53 missile warhead, that the weapon has no assured level of nuclear safety in a broad range of multiple abnormal environments. And the Titan II in Launch Complex 374-7 was about to be subject to extreme abnormal environments. While an accidental thermonuclear detonation was an extremely remote possibility, understand that this was a very old missile design, and it lacked all three of the critical safety components that Congress since 1993 has required of American nuclear missiles: an ENDS system, insensitive high explosives, and a fire-resistant pit. And the crews responding to the crisis in the silo had to be operating under the assumption that there was at least a possibility of a thermonuclear detonation. An emergency response team was dispatched, but just as two members of that team had been sent in to vent the gas from the silo, the missile exploded. It is possible that the missile had simply collapsed, but some experts argue that a fan that was activated to try to vent the fuel sparked the explosion. That initial explosion was so powerful that it blew the 740-ton missile silo door at the top 200 feet in the air and ejected the second stage with the thermonuclear warhead still attached, at which point the second stage proceeded to explode. At this point, we need to pause for a moment to bring up an interesting interlude. At the time, United States Air Force policy did not allow the Air Force to either confirm nor deny whether there was a nuclear warhead at an accident site, to the point where the United States Air Force initially refused to tell the sitting Vice President of the United States, Walter Mondale, who was in Little Rock, Arkansas for the Arkansas Democratic Convention with then Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, whether the missile that looked like it was about to explode just 50 miles away in Damascus had a nuclear warhead. In fact, the county sheriff who was in charge of the evacuation only found out that there was a thermonuclear warhead involved because he searched with his radio until he found the Air Force frequency and eavesdropped on their conversation. The explosion threw the warhead some 100 feet outside the complex's front gate, but the warhead released no radiation. The two critical response team members who were closest to the silo when the missile exploded took terrible injuries in the explosion, and sadly, one of them, Senior Airman David Livingston, died of his injuries. He died a hero trying to prevent a disaster. 21 other people who were nearby when the missile exploded also were injured in that explosion. The explosion pretty much destroyed the facility, but the demolition and cleanup still cost the Air Force about another $20 million. And the site where that silo once was is now private land and on the National Register of Historic Places. The Titan missile program was already towards the end of its lifespan in 1980, and it was discontinued, and the last of the Titan missiles was decommissioned in 1987. But there is still one Titan missile silo, complete with a deactivated Titan II missile that the public can go view at the Titan Missile Museum in Arizona. It's kind of funny that from 1980 that we remember Pac-Man and Post-it notes more than an intercontinental ballistic missile blowing up. But I guess the Damascus Titan II silo missile explosion is about as well remembered as top-loading VCRs. Which leaves a final question. Could this accident happen again today? The short answer is no. We have much safer designs today, and the United States no longer uses liquid-fueled intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the more complex answer is that what really happened in Damascus in 1980 was an unexpected series of events for which the Air Force was unprepared. And yes, unexpected things still happen today. I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series of short snippets of forgotten history about 10 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button, which is there on your left. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. And if you'd like more snippets of forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.